The Terran-Zephyrian peace accords had been signed with enough pomp and diplomatic ceremony to make historians weep with joy, but Captain Marcus Reed was discovering that maintaining interspecies peace was significantly more complicated than negotiating it. 6 months into his assignment as cultural attaché to the Zephyrian homeworld, he'd mastered the art of diplomatic small talk in 3 alien dialects, learned to appreciate cuisine that would have horrified his grandmother, and developed a healthy respect for Queen Lyriletha's ability to demolish trade negotiators who came unprepared for her intellectual precision. The Queen herself was unlike any leader Marcus had encountered in 15 years of diplomatic service. Where human politicians relied on charisma and compromise, she commanded through competence and conviction. Her throne room sessions were legendary for their efficiency. Complex disputes that might take human committees weeks to resolve were settled in hours through her combination of strategic thinking and absolute authority. "Captain Reed," she announced as he entered the chamber for their weekly briefing on agricultural exchange protocols, "your preliminary report on grain production capabilities contains several assumptions that require clarification." Marcus had learned that when Queen Lyrileth used the word clarification, she meant fundamental errors that need to be corrected before you embarrass both our species. He activated his tablet and prepared for what would probably be an educational but humbling discussion. "Your Majesty, I'm ready to address any concerns you've identified. Concern number 1, you've calculated Zephyrian soil composition based on terrestrial agricultural models. Our crop yields respond to mineral balances that human farming techniques don't account for." She proceeded to dismantle his analysis with the thoroughness of someone who'd clearly done her own research into human agricultural science before pointing out its limitations. Marcus found himself taking notes not just on policy corrections but on approaches to problem-solving that were more sophisticated than anything he'd learned in diplomatic training. Concern number 15, she continued 40 minutes later, your proposal for crop rotation schedules assumes Zephyrian growing seasons follow patterns similar to Earth seasons. Our agricultural calendar is based on lunar cycles that create growing conditions your models haven't considered. By the time she finished reviewing his report, Marcus had filled 6 pages with corrections and felt like he'd received a graduate course in interspecies agricultural science. But rather than feeling criticized, he found himself impressed by her depth of knowledge and attention to detail. "Your Majesty, thank you for the comprehensive review. It's clear I need to develop better understanding of Zephyrian environmental factors before making policy recommendations." "Indeed. However, your willingness to acknowledge errors is refreshing. Most diplomatic attaches defend their mistakes rather than learning from them." Something in her tone suggested this was high praise by Zephyrian standards. Marcus had noticed that Queen Lyrileth valued competence above diplomacy, intellectual honesty above social grace. "If I may ask, Your Majesty, would it be possible to arrange field visits to agricultural sites? Hands-on observation might help me develop more accurate models." "An excellent suggestion. I will arrange for you to accompany agricultural advisors on inspection tours. Understanding requires experience, not just theoretical knowledge." Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself spending increasing amounts of time in Queen Lyriletha's presence as their professional collaboration expanded beyond formal diplomatic meetings. The agricultural tours led to discussions of trade route efficiency, which evolved into strategic planning sessions for economic development initiatives that could benefit both species. "Captain Reed," she said during one particularly productive session, "your perspective on interstellar logistics is quite valuable. Human supply chain management appears more flexible than our traditional approaches. Your strategic planning methods are equally impressive, Your Majesty. Zephyrian long-term thinking could improve human policy development significantly." Their working relationship was developing into something that felt more like intellectual partnership than diplomatic protocol. Marcus discovered that beneath her regal authority, Queen Lyrileth possessed curiosity about human culture that went beyond political necessity. "Tell me," she said one evening as they reviewed economic projections in her private study, "do human leaders experience loneliness? The isolation that comes from making decisions that affect millions of lives?" The question was personal enough to fall outside normal diplomatic conversation, but her tone suggested genuine interest rather than political calculation. I think any leader experiences that isolation, Marcus replied carefully. The weight of responsibility can be overwhelming. For me, it is constant. To be queen means to be permanently separated from normal social connections. Every relationship becomes political, every conversation potentially consequential. Marcus found himself studying her face as she spoke, noting the weariness that royal composure usually concealed. That sounds incredibly difficult. It is the price of power. But sometimes I wonder. She paused, then seemed to decide against completing the thought. Forgive me. Such reflections are inappropriate during official meetings. Your Majesty, may I suggest that not all our conversations need to be official. Sometimes understanding between species requires personal connection rather than diplomatic protocol. Her expression shifted to something Marcus couldn't quite interpret, surprise, perhaps, or cautious interest. Captain Reed, are you suggesting that we might benefit from informal discussions? I'm suggesting that successful cooperation often depends on understanding the people behind the policies. The invitation that followed, to join her for dinner in her private quarters rather than the formal dining hall, marked a shift in their relationship that both recognized as significant. The evening began with discussions of interstellar trade policies but gradually evolved into conversations about leadership challenges, personal philosophies, and the loneliness that came with positions that placed them between their species. Marcus, she said, using his first name for the first time, do you ever regret choosing diplomatic service? The constant responsibility for representing your people's interests. Sometimes. But tonight, no. Tonight I think this assignment has offered opportunities one never expected. The attraction that had been building between them through weeks of intellectual collaboration finally found expression in a kiss that began tentatively and deepened into something that transcended diplomatic boundaries entirely. What followed was a night of intimacy that was both passionate and tender, complicated by the knowledge that they were crossing lines that could affect the relationship between their civilizations. When Marcus woke the next morning in his own quarters, having returned there in the early hours to maintain appearances, he found himself uncertain whether their encounter represented the beginning of something profound or a mistake that could complicate both their positions beyond repair. The Queen's message, delivered through formal channels later that day, was strictly professional. Their next meeting would focus on technology transfer protocols. But the memory of her touch and the vulnerability she'd shared in darkness left Marcus wondering if their relationship had fundamentally changed or if royal discretion would require them to pretend the night had never happened. 3 months of carefully maintained professional distance had taught Marcus several uncomfortable lessons about the intersection of personal feelings and diplomatic responsibility. Chief among them was that avoiding someone you'd shared intimate moments with became significantly more difficult when your job required regular meetings to negotiate the future of interspecies trade relations. The mineral extraction quotas require adjustment based on updated geological surveys, Queen Lirleth announced during their weekly policy briefing, her tone carrying the same authoritative precision it had always held, giving no indication that she remembered their night together or cared about his increasingly obvious discomfort. Marcus consulted his tablet with the focused attention of someone trying very hard not to notice that the Queen's presence still affected his heart rate in ways that had nothing to do with diplomatic anxiety. The survey data suggests we can increase extraction by 12% without environmental impact. 15%. Your calculations underestimate Zephyrian mining efficiency. Their professional interactions had become a carefully choreographed dance of mutual avoidance disguised as policy discussions. Marcus threw himself into research and analysis with intensity that his staff had begun to notice, while Queen Lirleth maintained royal composure that her advisors found increasingly brittle. Captain Reed, announced his deputy, Lieutenant Sarah Kim, during their morning briefing, your productivity has become extraordinary. Also concerning. You've submitted more policy analyses in the past 3 months than most attaches complete in a year. Thoroughness is important when dealing with interspecies agreements. Thoroughness, yes. Obsessive perfectionism that keeps you working 18-hour days, less important. Marcus couldn't explain that work provided distraction from memories that diplomatic training had never prepared him to handle. How did you process intimacy with someone whose political position made any relationship impossible? How did you maintain professional objectivity with someone you'd held in your arms while she shared vulnerabilities that royal authority usually concealed? Meanwhile, Queen Lireleth was experiencing her own challenges with maintaining royal composure. Her advisors had begun commenting on her increased irritability during council sessions, her distraction during strategic planning meetings, and her tendency to make decisions with uncharacteristic haste rather than her usual methodical consideration. "Your Majesty," ventured her chief counsel, advisor Thane, "perhaps you would benefit from reduced scheduling demands. The pace of interspecies negotiations has been quite intensive. The pace is acceptable. My focus is merely directed toward complex policy considerations." But her focus was actually directed toward avoiding eye contact with the human diplomat whose presence in her throne room created emotional responses that royal training had never equipped her to manage. She found herself analyzing his policy recommendations with unnecessary scrutiny, partly because his work was genuinely thorough, but mostly because extended criticism provided justification for longer meetings that she simultaneously craved and dreaded. The breaking point came during a particularly tense negotiation about technology transfer protocols, where 3 hours of careful diplomatic language failed to mask the underlying tension between them. The quantum computing specifications require cultural adaptation consideration, Marcus announced, his voice carrying the strain of someone maintaining professional demeanor through considerable personal effort. Cultural adaptation is unnecessary. Zephyrian technical capabilities exceed the limitations you're assuming. I'm not assuming limitations, Your Majesty. I'm suggesting that implementation timelines should account for training periods. Training periods that you've calculated based on human learning curves rather than Zephyrian cognitive capacity. The argument that followed was technically about educational methodology but emotionally about everything they weren't discussing. By the time their advisors intervened to suggest continued negotiations the following day, both Marcus and Queen Lireleth were exhibiting stress responses that had nothing to do with technology transfer disagreements. That evening, Marcus made a decision that his diplomatic training would have advised against but that his personal integrity demanded. He requested a private audience with Queen Lireleth to address the tension that was affecting their professional effectiveness. "Your Majesty, I believe we need to discuss the personal factors that may be complicating our working relationship." "There are no personal factors, Captain Reed. Our interactions are entirely professional. With respect, Your Majesty, our professional interactions have become notably strained since." He paused, realizing that even diplomatic language couldn't make this conversation comfortable, since we developed a more personal understanding of each other. Queen Lireleth's expression shifted from regal composure to something approaching vulnerability. "Marcus, what happened between us was complicated. It cannot happen again. I understand that. But avoiding each other while trying to negotiate complex agreements isn't working either. What do you suggest? Honest communication about boundaries. Clear agreement about how to maintain professional effectiveness while acknowledging what we shared." She was quiet for a long moment, her royal authority warring with personal feelings that she'd spent months trying to suppress. "Marcus, the night we spent together was the first time in years I felt like a person rather than a position. But I am still a queen, and you are still a diplomatic representative. Nothing can change those realities. I'm not asking to change them. I'm asking for us to find a way to work together without this constant tension." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of her personal physician, Dr. Zara, whose expression suggested urgent medical concerns rather than routine consultation. "Your Majesty, the test results you requested require immediate discussion." Marcus began to excuse himself, but Queen Lireleth's gesture indicated he should remain. "Dr. Zara, whatever you need to discuss can be said in Captain Reed's presence." "Your Majesty, the symptoms you've been experiencing, fatigue, nausea, hormonal fluctuations. They're not stress-related as we initially assumed." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized the direction this conversation was heading. "The biological scans confirm pregnancy, Your Majesty. Approximately 3 months along." The silence that followed carried weight that seemed to compress the air in the room. Marcus found himself staring at Queen Lireleth, whose expression cycled through shock, realization, and something that might have been terror. "Dr. Zara," she said carefully, "pregnancy with whom?" "I have not engaged in reproduction with any Zephyrian partners. The genetic markers indicate human paternity, Your Majesty. Which should be impossible according to current xenobiological understanding." Marcus felt the universe shift around him as implications cascaded through his consciousness. His research into Zephyrian reproductive biology had suggested that interspecies conception was theoretically possible but extremely rare, with documented cases numbering fewer than 12 in recorded history. "How certain are these results?" Queen Lireleth asked, her voice carrying forced calm that didn't mask underlying shock. "Completely certain, Your Majesty. You are carrying a hybrid child with human genetic contribution." As Dr. Zara excused herself to prepare detailed medical reports, Marcus and Queen Lireleth stared at each other across a distance that suddenly felt vast despite the small size of her private chamber. "Marcus," she said quietly, "what we thought was a personal complication has become a political crisis. Your Majesty, we need to discuss what this means for both our positions." "What this means, Captain Reed, is that everything we thought we understood about our situation has just become infinitely more complicated." The conversation they'd planned to have about maintaining professional boundaries while acknowledging personal history had suddenly become a discussion about the future of two civilizations and a child who would represent something unprecedented in interspecies relations. The week following Dr. Zara's revelation passed in a haze of emergency consultations, classified medical reports, and increasingly tense communications between Zephyrian and human diplomatic commands. Marcus found himself subject to medical examinations that treated him less like a diplomatic attaché and more like a xenobiological specimen whose reproductive capabilities had created an unprecedented situation requiring immediate analysis. "Captain Reed," announced Admiral Stevens through encrypted communication channels, "command requires a complete briefing on how this situation developed. The political implications are extensive." Marcus stared at his commanding officer's image on the secure display, knowing that any explanation he provided would sound either professionally negligent or personally irresponsible. "Sir, my relationship with Queen Lireleth developed gradually through normal diplomatic interaction. Neither of us anticipated biological consequences." "Captain, you're trained in xenobiological protocols. You knew that interspecies reproduction was theoretically possible." "Theoretically possible but extremely rare, sir. Medical literature suggests less than a 1% probability of successful conception between humans and Zephyrians. And yet here we are, dealing with a 1% probability that has created a 100% political crisis." Meanwhile, Queen Lireleth was facing similar pressure from her own advisors, who ranged from supportive to panic depending on their assessment of how hybrid offspring might affect Zephyrian succession law and interspecies relations. "Your Majesty," Advisor Thane explained during an emergency council session, "traditional succession law has no provisions for hybrid heirs. The child's legal status within Zephyrian society remains unclear. Then we modify succession law to accommodate new realities," Queen Lireleth replied with determination that masked her own uncertainty about the implications. "Modification requires council approval, public discussion, and potentially constitutional amendments that could take years to implement. Then we begin immediately." The political complexity was matched by personal tension that neither Marcus nor Queen Lireleth had been prepared to navigate. Their professional interactions became increasingly strained as both struggled with feelings about their situation that transcended diplomatic protocol. "Captain Reed," Queen Lireleth announced during what was supposed to be a routine briefing on trade agreements, "your recent reports show declining attention to detail. Perhaps you require medical leave to address personal stress." "Your Majesty, my work quality remains within acceptable standards." "Acceptable is insufficient when dealing with agreements that affect millions of lives." The conversation continued with professional language that barely concealed personal frustration. Marcus's attempts to provide emotional support were met with royal distance, while Queen Lyriletha's efforts to maintain political authority were complicated by physical changes that made pregnancy increasingly obvious. The crisis reached a breaking point when Marcus submitted a formal request for transfer to another assignment, citing irreconcilable differences in working relationship with primary Zephyrian contacts. The request triggered an immediate summons to Queen Lyriletha's throne room, where she waited with an expression that combined royal authority with barely controlled fury. "Captain Reed," she announced as he entered, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested emotional intensity barely held in check, "explain your request for reassignment." "Your Majesty, the current working relationship has become professionally untenable. Transfer to another position would serve both our interests." "Transfer would serve your interests." "My interests include having the father of my child present to discuss the implications of our situation." The accusation hung in the air between them, carrying emotional weight that formal diplomatic language couldn't deflect. "You impregnated me, human," she continued, her voice rising with each word, "and now you seek to flee rather than face the consequences of your actions." Marcus felt his own composure beginning to crack under the pressure of weeks of suppressed guilt and confusion. "Your Majesty, I'm not fleeing. I'm trying to protect both our positions from a situation that could compromise the peace accords." "Protect our positions? Or protect yourself from responsibility?" "Your Majesty, I never intended for this to happen. Intention is irrelevant. What matters is that you left me to face an unprecedented political and personal crisis alone while maintaining diplomatic pleasantries during our official meetings." The confrontation revealed emotional complexity that neither had been willing to acknowledge. Queen Lyriletha's fury stemmed not just from the pregnancy itself but from feeling abandoned during the most vulnerable period of her life, while Marcus's withdrawal had been motivated by fear of making the situation worse rather than genuine desire to escape responsibility. "You speak of protecting our positions," she continued, her royal authority now fully engaged, "but your protection feels remarkably like abandonment." Marcus stepped toward her, his diplomatic training finally overwhelmed by personal emotion. "Your Majesty, I was trying to respect your political autonomy. I thought distance would allow you to handle the situation without interference from someone whose presence might complicate your decision-making." "My decision-making? About our child? About the political implications? About how to manage succession law, constitutional questions, public reaction? About whether to continue the pregnancy?" The question stopped Marcus mid-sentence as he realized that his assumptions about her perspective had missed the most fundamental issue. "Your Majesty, yes. I assumed you would need space to consider all options without pressure from me. And what if I told you that termination was never under consideration? That the question was never whether to continue the pregnancy, but whether to face it alone or with the support of the child's father?" Marcus felt his understanding of their situation shift as he realized that his careful distance had been interpreted as rejection rather than respect for her autonomy. As he moved toward the exit, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions and implications he was finally beginning to understand, Queen Lyriletha's voice stopped him with commanding authority. "Captain Reed, you will not leave this throne room until we have resolved the political and personal implications of our situation." When he turned toward the door anyway, her hand caught his arm with strength that reminded him that Zephyrian royalty possessed physical capabilities that matched their political power. "There will be no escape from this conversation, Marcus. We will address what has happened between us and what it means for the future of both our species." As her grip tightened on his arm, Marcus realized that the careful diplomatic distance he'd maintained for months had finally collapsed, leaving them to confront the truth about their relationship and its consequences without the protection of professional protocol. The silence that followed Queen Lyriletha's physical restraint of Marcus stretched between them like a bridge neither had been willing to cross for months. Her grip on his arm carried both royal authority and personal desperation, while his stillness reflected the realization that escape had never really been an option, from the situation, from his feelings, or from the responsibilities they'd created together. "Your Majesty," Marcus said quietly, "you're right. I was trying to escape. Not from responsibility, but from the certainty that my presence would make everything more complicated for you." "More complicated?" Her voice carried bitter laughter. Marcus, I am carrying the first documented human-Zephyrian hybrid child in recorded history. My political position requires me to appear infallible while navigating constitutional questions that have never been addressed. How exactly did you imagine your absence would make this situation less complicated? I thought. He paused, realizing how inadequate his reasoning sounded when spoken aloud. I thought you would need to make decisions about the pregnancy and its political implications without feeling pressured by my presence or expectations. Queen Lireleth released his arm but moved to block his access to the door. What decisions, Marcus? What exactly did you think I might choose? Termination. Constitutional crisis prevention. Political damage control. Each phrase felt like an admission of failure as he spoke it. I assumed you would prioritize your political position over personal considerations. And you assumed this based on what understanding of my character? Marcus found himself confronting the uncomfortable truth that his diplomatic training had taught him to analyze political motivations but had left him completely unprepared for understanding personal ones. Based on fear, he admitted. Fear that staying would pressure you toward choices that served my interests rather than yours. Fear that leaving would seem like abandonment. Fear that any action I took would make things worse. So you chose the option that felt safest for you while leaving me to face the consequences alone. Yes. And I realize now that was cowardice disguised as consideration. Queen Lireleth's expression shifted from anger toward something that might have been relief. Marcus, do you want to know what decisions I've actually been making during these months of careful distance? Yes, Your Majesty. I've been modifying Zephyrian succession law to recognize hybrid children as full members of the royal lineage. I've been consulting with constitutional scholars about creating legal frameworks for interspecies inheritance. I've been meeting with medical advisors about prenatal care for unprecedented hybrid physiology. Marcus felt his assumptions about her priorities crumbling as she continued. I've also been wondering whether the father of my child cared about any of these developments, or whether his professional obligations had overridden any personal investment in our situation. Your Majesty. Lireleth. I care about all of it. About you, about the child, about the political implications. I was trying to give you space to handle the situation without interference from someone whose position might complicate your decision-making. My decision-making has been complicated by your absence, not your presence. Every choice I've made has included considerations about whether you would support or oppose the legal and political structures I'm creating. The revelation that she'd been building frameworks to include him rather than planning to exclude him shifted Marcus's understanding of their situation entirely. What do you need from me? He asked. I need you to stop making decisions about our relationship based on what you think I should want and start making them based on what you actually want. I want to be involved in our child's life. I want to support whatever legal and political structures you're creating. I want. He paused, realizing that admitting his actual desires required abandoning diplomatic caution entirely. I want to continue the relationship we began but never allowed ourselves to develop. Even though it means accepting a permanent position that will tie your career to Zephyrian politics. Even though it means our personal relationship will always be subject to political scrutiny. Especially because of those things. Lireleth, what we're creating together, the child, the legal frameworks, the diplomatic precedents, it's more important than any career considerations I had before. Queen Lireleth's royal composure finally cracked, revealing vulnerability that she'd been hiding behind political authority for months. Marcus, I've been terrified that you would see our child as an obligation rather than an opportunity. That you would view our relationship as a diplomatic complication rather than a personal connection worth protecting. And I've been terrified that asking for involvement would pressure you into choices that serve my interests rather than yours or our child's. They stood facing each other across the throne room, finally acknowledging fears that had driven their behavior for months while preventing the honest communication that could have resolved their situation. We've both been protecting each other from pressures that didn't exist, Marcus observed. While creating actual pressures that did exist, Lireleth agreed. Perhaps it's time to discuss what we actually want rather than what we think we should want. The conversation that followed lasted most of the night and covered everything from constitutional law to child-rearing philosophies to the practical challenges of maintaining an interspecies relationship under political scrutiny. By morning, they had developed plans that addressed both personal and political considerations. Marcus formally requested permanent assignment as cultural liaison to the Zephyrian court, a position that would allow him to remain involved in both the diplomatic relationship between their species and his personal relationship with Queen Lireleth. The position would also provide official justification for his presence during the development of legal frameworks governing their child's unique status. Queen Lireleth announced to her council that the pregnancy represented an unprecedented opportunity to strengthen interspecies cooperation through biological connection rather than merely political alliance. The constitutional modifications she'd been developing would establish precedents for future hybrid children while ensuring their offspring's full integration into Zephyrian society. 6 months later, Marcus stood in a medical facility adjoining the royal palace, holding his daughter, a perfect blend of human and Zephyrian features whose existence represented the success of cooperation that transcended species boundaries. Queen Lireleth had insisted on naming her Aria, meaning harmony between worlds, in ancient Zephyrian. She's going to grow up thinking interspecies cooperation is normal, Lireleth observed, watching their daughter sleep peacefully despite the political complexity surrounding her birth. Maybe that's exactly what the galaxy needs, Marcus replied. People who see cooperation as normal rather than remarkable. Their relationship had evolved into something that balanced political necessity with genuine affection, professional partnership with personal intimacy. The legal frameworks they developed together were already being studied by other governments as models for managing interspecies relationships that transcended formal treaties. Marcus, Lireleth said as they reviewed legislation that would govern future hybrid children's rights, "Do you ever regret that our diplomatic assignment became so, personally complicated?" Never. Though I should probably update my diplomatic resume under special achievements. What would you list? Successfully transformed interspecies incident into interspecies family. Negotiated unprecedented constitutional modifications. Accidentally became father to galactic cooperation symbol. Lireletha's laughter carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with their daughter's peaceful breathing. I think the galaxy could use more diplomatic incidents that result in this kind of cooperation. As they worked together on policies that would shape the future of interspecies relations, Marcus reflected that his journey from diplomatic attaché to royal partner and father had taught him something important about the relationship between personal and political responsibility. Sometimes the most important diplomatic work happened not in formal negotiations but in the courage to build genuine connections that transcended the boundaries between species, positions, and the careful distances that fear tried to maintain.